But our topic tonight, as I say, is Australia, the United States, and Asia. It's my great pleasure to present to you His Excellency John McCarthy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm always in somewhat of a quandary when I address a group as to whether I should use a prepared text or whether I should seek to speak extemporaneously, or at least not from a prepared text. I've actually always been put off prepared texts since I was at a seminar about 2 or 3 years back, and I looked over the shoulder of the speaker who was next up on the rostrum, and he had this long text, and I saw initialed in the margin the comment, "Weak point, shout." Since then, I felt that having a text is somehow a prop and is indicative of insufficient knowledge of one's subject or audience. But also, I think sometimes when the subject is reasonably serious and the audience is reasonably serious, there can be merit in using a text, mainly because one can happily get through the subject matter rather faster. And that also, I think, is sometimes of some attraction to an audience. There's nothing worse than a long speech. And I sense you might be able to get more out of this subject in the question and answer session rather than in listening to me opine. That, I think, that session will enable you to raise the issues which are really of greatest concern to you and which I, perhaps, as a speaker, can thus most beneficially address. So, thank you very much for this opportunity. It really is a privilege to be ambassador to the United States. I've had the good fortune to witness the workings of this society in crucial times. In the 60s, as it underwent the changes in civil rights and the great turbulence in its universities. In the 70s, at the end of the crusade in Vietnam, and as it questioned its political institutions in the wake of Watergate. And in the 80s, as the great defining conflict of the Cold War was drawing to an end. And now, in the 90s, as the United States is in the process of adjusting simultaneously to an unparalleled strategic preeminence, and, ironically, to a diminution in its relative economic preeminence. And it's particularly stimulating to be here at a time when both our countries are undergoing profound change. Some aspects of this change are internal. We've undertaken significant economic change, and we've dismantled most of the barriers which kept our economy uncompetitive. Capital markets have been deregulated and the dollar has been floated. And for its part, the United States is thinking deeply about the way it would like to be governed and the sort of society it aspires to be, exercising its unique capacity for debate and unblinking self-scrutiny. Simultaneously with both these internal developments, our two countries are also in the process of shaping their futures against a background of not one, but in my submission two crucially important developments, either one of which on its own would be momentous enough to define an epoch. And I refer, of course, to the end of the Cold War and the spectacular economic rise of East Asia. Our countries need to address both and to do so simultaneously. The Cold War was costly and harrowing. It involved the threat of nuclear war, an arms race, and behind the Iron Curtain, institutionalized oppression. But the balance of terror had a certain stark discipline, stability, and simplicity about it. It prevented small wars from escalating. It stifled local nationalisms. It was easier to gauge what was dangerous and what was not. Now, while the United States is the world's only superpower, the tasks that confront it are more complex and ambiguous. The world is now more fragmented. Power is shared by a larger number of players. Ethnic and religious conflict is widespread. Solutions and strategies are more uncertain, and more work needs to be done on prevention of conflict. But the international fluidity created by the end of the Cold War has allowed and continues to allow the development of new ideas and the exercise of initiative which can shape international developments in positive directions. It is important that we do this before new, less desirable structures and relationships evolve and harden. Now, on the second development, the growth of East Asia, a few statistics make the point. In the 20 years from 1970, East Asia's share of world gross domestic product rose from 12 to 25%, more than doubling with unprecedented speed. In the last decade, more than half the world's increased production was in East Asia. And it's estimated that these economies will maintain an average annual growth rate of 7% or more over the next 10 years, compared with a projected 2.7% for the G7 countries. Now, widening the region to embrace the countries of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, the latter together marshal 40% of the world's population, more than half the world's GDP, and over 40% of its exports. US trans-Pacific trade is 50% higher than United States transatlantic trade. Now, the United States and Australia both have to respond to these developments, the end of the Cold War and the economic rise of East Asia, both of which are interwoven. I'd like to explore these two sets of developments and the interaction between them and what they mean for both our countries, and I want to do so in the context of three arguments which are sometimes heard these days. They're not convincing, but because they have implications for our relationship, they need to be addressed. The first of these arguments is that in the absence of the Soviet threat, United States alliances, including our alliance, are losing their point and purpose. The second is that there is a growing spirit of isolationism, coupled with the growth of protectionism in the United States, and that this has serious implications for Australia. And the third is that Australia, in the process of developing its links with Asia, is doing so at the expense of its relationship with the United States, that it is, in effect, turning away from the West. Now, first, the alliance. While the world may indeed be a safer place than it was 10 years ago, it's also less certain and less stable. Strong security relationships are arguably most crucial in periods of uncertainty. At a time when international dealings are more fluid, when the incidence of local hostilities has significantly increased, and when new centres of global and regional power are emerging, strong alliances bring a welcome element of geostrategic stability. Now, in the immediate euphoria and optimism following the collapse of communism, there was a certain sense that stability was a small-minded, unambitious goal. After the Gulf War, the violence in much of Africa, and most of all the war in Bosnia, we are more conditioned to appreciate its virtue. And the more we appreciate it, the more evident is the value of dependable alliances. Moreover, the work of an alliance is not only to prepare for the contingency of war, it is to build international mechanisms to prevent it or to diminish its effect. And Australia and the United States have worked closely and effectively on key international treaties, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention. They're also working closely together now on the CTBT. Second, I'd like to address the issue of alleged isolationism. For an ally of the United States, the presence of the Soviet threat meant that the United States as a whole saw global strategic engagement as being in the realm of necessity, not of choice. While the removal of that threat may not have negated the United States' interest in such global strategic engagement, it has, at least in the perception of many, widened the discretionary area in America's strategic calculation. The view seems to have gained ground in this country that the United States should engage in military ventures only when its own direct interests, often defined in the narrow terms of an immediate threat to the United States, are affected. This can also translate into the perception, put crudely, that other people's problems should be solved by other people. Events to date suggest that while exercise of the United States' global reach may now be a matter of choice rather than necessity, it has chosen activism rather than a strategic retreat. Its diplomacy has made progress in the Korean Peninsula. It has put troops into the Gulf, Somalia, Haiti, and now Bosnia. It may yet deploy troops on the Golan Heights. Some of these steps have been resisted internally, and it has to be conceded that they have not all been unmitigated successes. Yet the United States has gone ahead. Success or failure in Bosnia in the coming year may be crucial in determining whether it continues to do so. The related concern about protectionism has arisen from reactions within the United States over the past decade to the trade deficit, particularly with East Asian countries. It enacted legislation which toughened market access, hit competitors in third markets, and imposed unilateral sanctions on trading partners. While most of these actions were unwelcome and some were unfair, they amount to much less than a reversion to protectionism on the part of the United States. Accusations to that effect are exaggerated. There is, after all, much in the other column to balance these restrictions. The United States, more than any other country, pushed through the Uruguay round. The United States concluded NAFTA, and the United States has thus far been a crucial and progressive player within APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. That said, these issues of so-called isolationism and so-called protectionism, and in each case the terminology is dubious, are live ones. The United States is currently debating its future, including how it will relate to its external environment. It cannot be assumed that in the absence of an overwhelming United States interest, amounting to necessity, that the United States will sustain the same commitments that it is currently prepared to sustain. Equally, trade debates in the United States, but not only trade debates, have revealed in some quarters a fatigue with foreign problems and a sense that the United States is losing out to other countries. being cheated, and that it should ignore these countries or hit back. It will, I suspect, be some years before we know how these dilemmas will evolve. The United States has agonized before between foreign involvement and concentration on more visibly pressing and more politically rewarding domestic issues. I take comfort from a sense that having for half a century worn the mantle of world leadership, the United States will not wish to relinquish it. With its capacity for pragmatism tempered with idealism, it will recognize that its true interests lie in keeping its gaze outward. Third, turning to East Asia, I should say first off, we are not seeking Australia to be an Asian nation. We are what we are. But we are seeking to build structures and habits which will enable us better to live and work within our own region. The closer relationship which we have sought to develop with Asia in past years is partly driven by economic realities. Already, over half our trade is with East Asia. Taking into account the growth of that region I mentioned earlier, the reasons for our engagement with Asia appear compelling. However, our motivations are deeper than that. They include a genuine desire for real involvement, including to develop our security links with our neighbors. This is important in Indonesia, with whom we recently signed a new security agreement, which builds upon the development of our bilateral defense ties with that country. We've also sought to build people-to-people contact, and in this language is central. By the year 2006, 60% of all children in Australia from years 3 to 10 will be studying an Asian language. But none of this means that we're moving away from the United States. International relationships are not part of a zero-sum game. For Australia, the issue of our engagement in Asia and our relationship with the United States is not an either-or matter. We need both. For the simple fact is that both Australia and the United States have an enormous stake in East Asia. It is in the interests of both the United States and Australia that the other enjoys close relations with Asia. The United States has long been the central component of a balance of power in Asia. The interests of China, of Japan, and of Russia all intersect there. The continued deployment of United States forces in Asia, both for practical security reasons and because of their symbolic importance, is in the interests of both the United States and all the countries of Asia. The success of the East Asian economies owes much to United States investment and to United States buying power. For the United States, closer links between Australia and other countries in our region enhance regional stability, a comment made by American colleagues after the signature of the Australia-Indonesia Treaty. Now, all these factors were integral to our approach to the formation of post-Cold War Asia-Pacific structures which until then had been conspicuously lacking. While that deficiency was sustainable in earlier decades, it had become a serious anachronism by the end of the 1980s, given the dynamism and interaction within the region. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation grouping had its first meeting in 1989, and since the summits in Bogor in Indonesia in 1994 and Osaka last year, has reached agreement on an ambitious framework for total regional trade liberalization. In all these organizations in Asia, Australia regards the active participation of the United States as crucial. This brings me to a final point. Australians don't just have to think about how we regard the United States in a post-Cold War situation and how we should regard the rise of Asia. We also have to think of a third dimension, and that is how the United States addresses Asia. The management of a constructive, viable, and strong Asian policy is not an easy one for the United States. The debate on how the United States should relate to its whole external environment, of course, affects its approach to Asia. And currently, the United States has to give priority to crises and immediate negotiating situations, such as Bosnia and in the Middle East. Its capacity to focus sustained high-level policy attention on several areas of the world at the same time is limited. Moreover, with the simple choices of the Cold War gone, the mold of United States policy is shaped more markedly by a greater diversity of pressures. Economic pressures, particularly on China and Japan. Cultural and humanitarian pressures, for example, on China. And strategic requirements, particularly in relation to China and Taiwan, which is so topical now, and to the Korean Peninsula. In the longer, but not so long, term, the existence in East Asia of two key formidable great powers, Japan and China, plus a weakened but still powerful Russia, plus some significant lesser powers like Korea and Vietnam, may constitute the most difficult geopolitical problem of all for the United States, particularly bearing in mind that its economic involvement in the region will be greater than in any other region. These challenges for the United States argue all the more strongly for rapid strengthening of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation grouping, not only because of the growth it will bring to the region, because it will create an independence between the main powers of Asia, which would diminish the potential for regional tension. To go further, we would hope that the United States' economic engagement in Asia would reinforce the essential political underpinnings of its security relationship to the extent that its continued commitment to stability and prosperity in the region is not a matter of choice, but a matter of necessity. Looking at all these issues together, we can be confident but not complacent. We are both adjusting to new sets of circumstances. Australia is shaping a new destiny for itself in its own region. America remains internationalist. Its voice is still decisive. It's the only global power. We both have to adapt to change, and not only to adapt to it, but to take advantage of it, including the challenges of opportunities of Asia. And in these endeavors, we should continue to draw from each other support and strength. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, we thank you very much for a comprehensive and very insightful presentation. We're in your debt for that. The floor is now open for questions.
Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Washington. We talked about a big triangle, Australia, America, and Asia. And my question relates to that. I recall when you were in Washington in 87, 88, the U.S. Congress and the government was forcing Japan to buy beef from the United States. And there was quite a meeting, and the industry got involved in, because my question is that whereas U.S. pressure on one country might have a negative impact on a third party. So in your job as ambassador now, as vis-a-vis at the time when you were Congressional Relations Officer, do you think that problem still exists when the U.S. puts pressure on a third country, it might have a negative impact on a country such as yours, particularly in commercial areas?
Okay. Do you mean that when it puts pressure on one country, it may have an unfavorable impact on a third country?
For instance, like when we put pressure on Japan to buy more beef or other produce from the United States, it might have a negative impact on Australia as exporting light quantities of light produce to Japan.
I think, I mean, this raises, I think, several aspects of United States trade policy towards Asia. I remember the debate of 1987 and 1988 leading to the passage of the Trade Act well. I think that strong trade actions, to use the terminology of the time, to attain a level playing field can have both pluses and minuses for third countries. The United States has to make its position known, and it's dealing around the world with some pretty tough trading partners: the European Union, Japan, China. And so a bit of toughness in negotiation never does any harm. And the issue of access to the Japanese market for beef actually was of benefit to Australian beef producers, because the Japanese market was opened to us also as part of the deal. You didn't, and you couldn't have really, have just sought access only for American beef. I mean, that would have been contrary to the various GATT rounds, or certainly contrary to the spirit of the Uruguay round, which was about to be negotiated. Anyway, that wasn't really possible. So in that sense, it was a plus. I think when the United States is tough on a whole range of countries around Asia, for example, when it's tough on Japan, when it's tough on China, when it is tough on Southeast Asia on different issues, a couple of things have to be appreciated. First, to your benefit, you have to fight for your rights. Nobody doubts that. The other thing, though, that you perhaps need to appreciate in this country is that if the United States gets engaged in a very significant trade dispute with another country, and it's not always in the right, that dispute takes on an enormous perspective in that other country, far, far larger than you might think it takes on here. For example, if there is a problem over palm oil with Malaysia, if there is a problem with meat access with Australia, if there is a problem with intellectual property with Thailand or China, and you fight hard, I think you need to bear in mind you've got to be very careful how you fight, because it does affect perceptions of you to a much greater degree than you expect. And you're not always fair on these issues. I mean, often you're the wrong party. In some cases, we would argue that the country in Asia or Australia is the wrong party. It really is far more visible the other side. That brings me to my final point, I suppose, that fighting these trade disputes can rub over into other areas of your overall relationship in a way which you don't mean and which you don't really expect. But nonetheless, that is the impact on countries in Asia. And I suppose if you say, you know, what difference does it make to third countries if you hit Japan hard on beef or hard on something else? The principal impact is going to be felt on Japan, because most people are after themselves. I mean, that's what they're concerned about. But if it is a process, you know, right round the region, a perception grows up that the United States is not a good trading partner. I think at the end of the day, that's not in your interests.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
One other question follow-up is that if a lot of bilateral agreements on aviation, for instance, like Northwest, gain access from Detroit directly to Beijing, is there any bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Australia that might benefit BWI Airport?
I'm sure. but you better get your civil aviation negotiators onto it.
Yes, at the microphone.
Your Excellency, how would you characterize Australia's relations with Indonesia?
our relationship with Indonesia is very wide-ranging, and on the whole it's pretty good. It's, I suppose to use a slightly glib word, it is multifaceted. There are a lot of aspects to it. I would say that on a political and strategic plane, the relationship has improved enormously over the past 5 years. And I think it is epitomised by the Australia-Indonesia Treaty, which was signed just before Christmas last year, of enormous importance, I think, for the future of both our countries in the region. Economic relationship has grown enormously. Major Australian companies are investing in Indonesia. Our bilateral trade has risen by about 30% a year, 35% a year. There is an area of difference, quite serious difference, and that is over the situation in East Timor. The Indonesians, as you know, went into East Timor shortly after the change of government in Portugal and the process of decolonisation commencing in the Portuguese colonies. And the East Timorese people are different ethnically to the Indonesians. It was in effect a takeover. We have accepted that this is the situation, that the Indonesians now effectively rule over the territory of East Timor. There have been serious human rights abuses in East Timor, and we have taken issue with the Indonesians on that. It is a continuing area of problems in our relationship, but it is really the only major area of difference with the Indonesians.
I think the thrust of the question is whether cultural forces might be more prominent in public affairs than straightforward economic and political theoretical considerations. And I think hidden within that is the question of whether differences in regimes, straightforwardly non-democratic and democratic societies, those issues will continue to be powerful relative to traditional economic and political questions.
Would anybody else like to interpret it?
It's the ambassador's ball to carry.
Okay, I'll give a try at answering anyway. I think, okay, just a few points. Over the last 15 years, there have been enormous economic imperatives which have led to the growth of the Asia-Pacific region and which have given it much more cohesion than it had prior to that period. And that has led to the sort of growth rates which I was talking about. First of all, there was the growth of Japan in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, beginning to level off, but still enormously big and enormously powerful. Second, there was the growth of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. Third, there was, at about the same time, perhaps a little bit later, was the growth of the Southeast Asian countries, the ASEAN countries, and lastly, the enormous growth of China. Now, all these growth patterns have added together, and they've meant that there is really a very significant amount of intra-regional trade, and there is an enormous scope for greater cohesion because of economic factors. And this, of course, led to APEC, and I don't want to go on about APEC. It is crucial to Australian foreign policy. It is about an economic grouping in the Asia-Pacific region, which will have, this is clearly the aim, and it's the stated aim of the leaders, free trade for the developed countries by 2010, and for the developing countries, as no tariffs, by 2020. It's very, very important. So there is that economic growth factor. Second, and I just want to touch on this because it is something that one hears more and more about, despite differences of ideology, you hear more and more discussion about Asian values, Asian cultures. This is a series of arguments that are put forward to a very significant degree by the Malaysians and Singaporeans to suggest that there's a way of looking at issues within Asia which is different to the way that Westerners look at issues, and that the Asian way of doing things has just as much merit as the Western way of doing things. They talk about Confucianism, the importance of society rather than the importance just of the individual. There are a number of theories to this. One can debate that forever. But the fact of the matter is there is talk of cohesive Asian values, irrespective of ideological difference. So there are two factors which some people argue, anyway, lead to greater cohesion in the Asia-Pacific region, or the Asian region anyway, irrespective of other aspects. But looking at, I think, at the thrust of your question, the differences between, say, China on the one hand and countries with a Western legal system on the other, quite clearly those differences are enormous. And so are also the differences between the various peoples of Asia. There is a lot of difference between a Filipino and somebody from Bangladesh. There's an enormous amount of difference between a Japanese and an Indonesian. Let's just not deny that. And that these differences are going to, and then there are also, on top of that, very significant ideological differences. The system in China is clearly totally different from the system in Thailand. So there will be a lot of forces for fragmentation, if you like, at play as well. Looking at the future, I mean, it's just impossible to see how it's going to evolve, but I think, provided that the big risks don't provided that the worst case scenarios don't evolve in Asia, the direction should be in favor of greater economic cohesion. The worst case scenarios are obviously severe instability in Northeast Asia, the China-Taiwan question. How 10 or 15 years hence is China going to evolve? What will be the relationship between China and Japan 15 years hence? All those are very, very big issues. But the thrust over the last 15 years is in favor of actually greater cohesion in the Asia-Pacific region. And the US, of course, has to have a major slice of that. It's crucial, crucial, crucial. Okay.
Yes, sir. Can you reach this? As this economic development goes forward, I've seen reports where countries, for instance, like China, which has been energy sufficient, will become energy deficient. All of these countries are reported to will need vast increases in oil. All of them will become importers. This is reputed to change relationships between them and the Middle Eastern countries, fundamentalist Muslims. There can be conflicts over Off-Sea oil. Could have impact on nuclear development. Could you comment on how this might impact?
Yeah, I mean, what you say, particularly about China and China's fuel requirements for its economic development, is absolutely true. And that does lead to speculation that they will develop their relationships more with the Middle East. It also leads to speculation as to what might happen in the Spratlys and Paracels. There is a need for all these countries to have fuel for their economic development. I'd have to say that, any sort of strategic calculation would need to take all these factors into account. But they have the point about need for fuel for economic development as a strategic factor has been around for 25, 30 years. It hasn't necessarily been the cause of dispute, but it's often a very central factor in how countries think. For example, the Gulf War recently. The answer is I can't give you a specific response. Yes, it is a very important factor in making strategic calculations for the Asia-Pacific region, crucial. But I can't say that they're going to run out in 7 years and we're then going to be on the brink. I don't think it's a case of that. Countries make accommodations, find other sources of fuel. There are big oil finds that people hadn't thought of before. All these factors seem to come into play. But it's a very good question. It's something we have to think about.
At the microphone, yes.
Your Excellency, could you comment on any expected expected changes, if any, in the change of government in Australia?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad somebody asked me that question, because I have to say it's sort of odd not for an Australian ambassador 2 weeks after election not to talk about it. I think the answer is no. Had we, not significant, had we been talking about changes of government 10 to 13, 15 years ago between the Australian coalition, or Conservative Party if you like, Conservative parties, and the Australian Labor Party or Socialist Party on the other hand, that you would have discerned amongst a well-informed American audience a certain sort of sense of anticipation. Because I think 10 to 15 years ago, the coalition was very much all the way with the United States, really followed the United States extraordinarily closely, whereas the Labor Party, or certainly the left wing of the Labor Party in Australia, took the sort of approach that you would expect left-wing the left wing of Labor parties around the world to take vis-a-vis the United States. I mean, it questioned everything the United States did and protested about a lot of things the United States did, particularly United States foreign policy. Now, over the past, and this was a lot to do with Vietnam, where a coalition government was with the United States in Vietnam, very strongly with it. All the way with LBJ, an Australian Prime Minister said that publicly. And the Labor government opposed involvement in the war. It was an element of its platform, opposition to involvement. So a very, very severe difference of approach. So when the Labor Party came in, obviously, first in 1973, the United States was pretty worried. And the reactions were sharp and there were big differences. But over the last 10 years, the position of the Labor Party on strategic and foreign policy issues has become much, much closer to the norm, to the view of the coalition. Close to the United States, very similar identity of interest on most alliance issues, not all, but took a different position, for example, to that of New Zealand on the issue of deployment of nuclear ships in the Pacific, American nuclear ships into ports in the Pacific. So, there has been a real evolution over the last 13 years. So when the Labor Party was voted out, as it was 2 weeks ago, the position in relation to the United States was unchanged, really. The coalition took over the reins of government, and my work, I find, thus far anyway, is very little different. Now, one other point I should make, because occasionally I do have to make a propaganda point, and that is, under either government, under a Labor government or a coalition government, there will continue to be quite notable differences with the United States on trade policy issues, on questions of access to the United States market, and on questions of the United States subsidizing in third country markets which affect our exports. Very important issues for Australians and Australian farmers, and they, it's been a long time. It's been a problem now for over 10 years. And that that will be addressed with the same amount of enthusiasm, let's put it that way, with a new government as with the old. Having said that, I should say that the problems themselves are less of an issue now than they were 10 years ago, but they are still an issue. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Ambassador, there's a worldwide shortage of grains right now.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please comment on what Australia's policy is vis-a-vis agricultural policy, and particularly how it is going to view its role in terms of trade, agricultural trade with China, because they really are one of the most preeminent factors in terms of driving the agricultural markets right now?
The preeminent factors in doing what?
In the agricultural markets. It's their consumption of grains that are really driving these markets.
Well, I suppose there are, I mean, again, it's a very good question. There is a grain shortage which has increased the price of grain. And that, is something that obviously Australian farmers are thankful for. Bear in mind, however, that we have been through a series of droughts. The situation is now better than it was, but the Australian farmers had enormous problems with grain supply. Also, we can't sell all the grain we would like to be able to sell because we haven't got it. It's just we can't supply the demand. But we have undertaken a long-term supply contract with China that, is part of our, I think, marketing practice and the practice of a number of other countries. And we've done that because the Chinese asked us to do it and because our farmers like the idea of assured demand, because the supply-demand, or the demand-supply situation will not necessarily be the same in 2 or 3 years' time. Has that answered your question? What is our agricultural policy? Our agricultural policy is very much non-subsidization. It's a free trader policy. We don't subsidize our farmers, and we would very much like to have a situation obtain in which other countries also did not do so. In that context, we've noted the recent improvements in the Farm Bill, which still has to be negotiated in conference. It's about to go into conference. But we've noticed the improvements in that, and we hope that they'll stay there and the President will sign off on it.
The nature of the contractual arrangement that you have with China in terms of supplying them with grains, is that based on a set price or is that subject to market fluctuation?
I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know the contractual arrangements on it.
Again at the microphone, I think unfortunately this will have to be our last question.
Mr. Ambassador, we've seen in the press much reporting on the current situation between China and Taiwan.
Sure.
Comment as one of the public areas to the Chinese mainland to the potential to China. Would you please provide us the Australian view of the current situation, include the U.S. reaction, and what harbinger do you think that might have for the future to include the assimilation of
Yeah, I mean, I guess if Australia had its way, it would just to say to all three of the party's principles, stop it. But I'll try and give you a slightly more sophisticated answer than that. I think one needs to bear in mind the political dynamics which are extant in each of the three countries. First of all, you have in China a country where the leadership is changing, where there is a very real difficulty in countenancing any suggestion that Taiwan is not Chinese, is not part of China. All sorts of things can be done in terms of Taiwan having its own system, its own individual dealings, but that leadership cannot countenance the idea of Taiwanese independence. It is secondly undergoing through for a whole host of different reasons, a very large number of bilateral problems with the United States. It's not only the Taiwan issue, it is human rights, it is the issue of most favored nation, trade status, it is the question of access to the World Trade Organization, it is the question of exports of a nuclear-related nature to Pakistan. There are a real number of very serious bilateral issues with the United States. And in this period of leadership transition, in particular, the Chinese have, intellectual property is another one, of course, the Chinese have a real problem in appearing to be giving way to the United States, all the factors of national pride that any large country has to take into account. The Taiwanese, for their part, are feeling confident. They've had a very good run since Tiananmen. They are more widely acknowledged for, as a commercially prosperous country. They have good links with Asian countries, European countries, and the United States. There is a certain amount of muscle flexing going on, though I think perhaps a measure of caution has come in recently. And as for the United States, I don't think I'm being indiscreet when I say it's an election year. You have a complicated system of government, which the Chinese do find difficult to fathom. You have the enormous strength in your system of Congress. Now, for a lot of countries, that is difficult to comprehend. It's difficult to work with. And they find it hard to understand the weight and significance which should be attributed, for example, to congressional resolutions. What is the effect of this? What does it mean? How much is it part of the American position? Very, very difficult for the Chinese to understand that. And they see some of the demands placed upon them by the United States and other Western countries, including Australia. But the United States position is important because it is so big on, for example, human rights as being essentially not their business. It's an internal affair. Bear in mind, that it is a country of 1.2 billion people with enormous problems, with a very long tradition of governing themselves, and they don't particularly like being told how they should run their affairs. Well, we mightn't agree with them, we mightn't like the way they do things, but I think there is a certain obligation for us to get inside their heads to some degree also. Now, all those three factors, those sets of factors, coming at the same time. Timing is everything in international affairs. But all these things are happening at the same time, leading to a potentially explosive situation. Now, insofar, what we would like to happen is, like I said before, we'd just like everybody to stop it. But I think what we would say is that it is important that the United States understand that there is a transition going on. The US does, of course. But bear in mind what China is thinking, that the United States should be careful to be measured in its approach to the Chinese. I think actually it is doing this. And that the Chinese should avoid taking actions which are provocative. And that by the same token, it is crucial that everybody seek to ensure that the Taiwanese do not act in such a way as to lead the Chinese to believe that they are really striking out for independence. There are two aspects to the problem, if I can put it simply, as to what might happen. There is the short-term consequence, which worries us. Obviously, it worries everybody, and that is that the situation in the Taiwan Straits might blow up into something much greater than anybody had wanted, which could lead to hostilities which would be destabilizing for the region. That's the sort of short-term issue. There is the longer-term issue, and that is incidents such as this, plus other developments in the bilateral relationship which are adverse in all these areas which I'm discussing, intellectual property, nuclear issues, and so on, that this could lead to a longer-term attrition in the relationship between the United States and China, which would be seriously destabilizing. China really, and East Asia generally, requires an enormous amount of political energy on the part of the United States. It is crucially important to the United States. It is just as important as Europe to the United States. In our view, the most important bilateral relationship in the world is the bilateral relationship between China and the US. It is not the US and Britain, it is not the US and Japan, it is not the US and Russia. It is the US and China. And I really don't want to be alarmist here, and please don't misunderstand what I say when I say this, but I was talking to a student of foreign policy in Washington, and we were talking about the situation in East Asia. And this man, who worked all his life on East Asia, said, well, bear in mind where the United States gets into trouble is when it hasn't sufficiently prepared itself. It hasn't really immersed itself in the issues in detail, understood them at all levels of the administration and Congress. He referred to Vietnam, he referred to Korea, and also, in fact, to the Second World War, where there was basically not enough attention going on into areas of what subsequently became conflict. And now, I don't want to suggest for one moment that we are heading for hostilities between the US and China. That would be, I think, misleading and just wrong, dead wrong. But I think what needs to be borne in mind is that what is happening in the Asian theater is just as important for US security and global security, if not a lot more important than what is happening over the other side. Okay, I mean, I think I've probably made my case as well as I can.
Or perhaps as well as anyone could. We thank you for that marvelous last answer, which is symbolic of the evening. We thank you for your thoughtfulness, for what was a very informative evening, and for your frankness with us. It's been a wonderful evening for which we thank you greatly.